The bruise on Tommy's cheek was already turning purple when Maya picked him up from school, and the careful way her 10-year-old son held his ribs as he climbed into the back seat made her stomach twist with a fury so intense she had to grip the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white to keep from driving straight to the principal's office and demanding answers she knew wouldn't come. This was the third time in 2 months that Tommy had come home with visible injuries, and the third time the school had called it an accident during recess, or boys being boys, or some other euphemism that translated to, "We're not going to do anything about the fact that your son is being systematically terrorized." "Does it hurt?" Maya asked quietly, her eyes meeting Tommy's in the rearview mirror as she pulled away from the curb. Her son sat hunched in the back seat, with his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield, his dark hair falling into his eyes in a way that made him look even younger and more vulnerable than his 10 years. "I'm fine," Tommy said automatically, but his voice was small and tight in a way that made Maya's heart crack down the center. "It was my fault anyway. I should have just given them my lunch money." Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel hard enough that the leather creaked under her grip. The casual acceptance in her son's voice, the way he had already learned to blame himself for being victimized, was almost worse than the physical injuries. She thought about her ex-husband David, about the way he had spent 8 years systematically destroying her sense of self-worth with the same tactics these children were using on Tommy, and felt bile rise in her throat at the realization that she had somehow failed to protect her son from learning the same terrible lessons about power and submission that she had spent the last 2 years trying to unlearn herself. "It's not your fault," Maya said firmly, pulling into a parking spot near Riverside Park, even though they should probably go straight home so she could ice Tommy's ribs. But the apartment felt too small when Tommy was hurting, too full of the ghosts of arguments and fear that still lingered despite the fact that David had been gone for 2 years. The park, at least, was neutral territory. "Tommy, look at me. It's not your fault that other kids are being cruel. You didn't do anything to deserve this." Tommy's eyes met hers in the mirror for just a moment before sliding away, and Maya could see the disbelief written across his young face as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. He didn't believe her. He had heard her tell him it wasn't his fault too many times, while simultaneously watching her fail to actually stop it from happening. And at some point, her reassurances had lost whatever power they might have once held. "Can we just sit by the pond for a while?" Tommy asked quietly, already opening the car door despite the way it clearly hurt him to move. "I don't want to go home yet." Maya followed him through the park gates and toward the large pond where ducks congregated in hopes of being fed by visitors. The October air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the approaching end of autumn, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts that should have been beautiful, but instead just made the shadows feel deeper and more oppressive. Tommy found a bench near the water and sat down with the careful movements of someone much older than 10, and Maya settled beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that she was invading his space. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the ducks paddle lazily across the water, and Maya tried to formulate something to say that would make this better, that would give Tommy the tools he needed to navigate a world that seemed determined to punish kindness and reward cruelty. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was that Maya didn't know how to fix this any more than she had known how to fix her own situation with David until it had gotten so bad that leaving had become the only option, and she couldn't teach Tommy to be brave when she had spent so many years being the opposite of brave, when she had let fear dictate every decision until it had nearly destroyed her. A man appeared on the path ahead of them, and Maya's attention sharpened automatically, her body tensing with the hypervigilance that 2 years away from her ex-husband still hadn't managed to completely erase. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of controlled grace that suggested either military training or something more dangerous, and he was dressed in a way that seemed almost incongruous with the park setting. Expensive charcoal suit with the jacket unbuttoned, crisp white shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, leather shoes that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent. His dark hair was styled perfectly despite the breeze, and there was something about the sharp planes of his face and the alertness in his dark eyes that made Maya's instincts whisper warnings even as he passed them without so much as a glance. He took a seat on a bench about 20 feet away, pulled out his phone, and proceeded to ignore the rest of the world with the kind of focus that suggested whatever was on that screen was more important than anything happening around him. Maya relaxed slightly, turning her attention back to Tommy, but she was aware of the man in the way she had become aware of all men since leaving David, cataloging his position, his body language, his potential threat level with the exhausting vigilance of someone who had learned that danger could wear expensive suits and charming smiles. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was so quiet Maya almost didn't hear it over the sound of the ducks. "Do you think some people are just meant to be weak? Like maybe that's just how they're made, and there's nothing they can do about it?" The question hit Maya like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her chest ache with the kind of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. She opened her mouth to answer, to tell Tommy that he wasn't weak, that strength came in many forms, that being kind and gentle didn't mean being powerless. All the things she had told herself in therapy, all the mantras her counselor had given her to combat the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like David telling her she was pathetic and worthless. But before she could speak, Tommy stood up abruptly and walked away from the bench, moving toward the stranger with the phone with the kind of desperate determination that made Maya's heart stop in her chest. She was on her feet immediately, moving to intercept him, but Tommy was already approaching the man, was already speaking in that small, brave voice that broke Maya's heart. "Excuse me, sir?" Tommy said, and the man looked up from his phone with an expression of surprise that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being interrupted. "Can I ask you something?" The man's dark eyes moved over Tommy, taking in the bruised cheek and the careful way he was holding himself, and something shifted in his expression. A sharpening of attention, a narrowing of focus that reminded Maya of a predator identifying prey. But when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, carrying just a hint of an accent that Maya couldn't quite place. "Of course. What's your name?" "Tommy." Her son's hands were clenched at his sides, his small body vibrating with tension, and Maya could see him gathering his courage for whatever he was about to say. "I know this is going to sound really weird, but I need to ask you something important. Can you teach me how to be brave?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the ducks and the distant traffic. The man stared at Tommy with an expression Maya couldn't read, something complicated and painful flickering across his features before he controlled it. Maya moved closer, ready to pull her son away and apologize for the intrusion, but the man held up one hand slightly, a gesture that somehow communicated both authority and gentleness. "That's not a weird question at all," the man said seriously, setting his phone aside and giving Tommy his complete attention. "But before I can answer, I need to know why you're asking. What happened to your face, Tommy?" Tommy's eyes darted to Maya, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance, and she gave him a small nod, even though her heart was pounding with anxiety about where this conversation might lead. Tommy turned back to the stranger and squared his shoulders in a way that was clearly meant to make him look bigger and braver than he felt. "Some kids at school beat me up," he said quietly. "They do it a lot, and I never fight back because fighting is wrong, and Mom says we should solve problems with words. But words don't work when the other person won't listen, and I'm tired of being scared all the time. I'm tired of being the kid everyone picks on because they know I won't do anything about it. So I thought if I could learn to be brave, maybe they would leave me alone." The man was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenching and unclenching in a way that suggested he was struggling with some powerful emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I'm going to tell you something important, Tommy, and I need you to really hear me. Are you listening?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide and fixed on the stranger's face, with the kind of desperate hope that made Maya want to gather him up and shield him from further disappointment. "Bravery isn't about never being afraid," the man said, "and it's not about fighting or being tough or any of that nonsense people tell you about being a man. Real bravery is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Real bravery is standing up for what you believe in, even when it costs you something. And real bravery is asking for help when you need it, which is exactly what you just did by approaching a complete stranger in a park and asking me to teach you. That took courage, Tommy. More courage than most adults I know would have." Tommy's lower lip trembled slightly, and Maya saw tears gathering in his eyes, despite his obvious efforts to hold them back. "But I'm scared all the time. And I never fight back. Doesn't that make me a coward?" "No," the man said firmly. "It makes you someone who was taught that violence is wrong, which is good. But there's a difference between choosing not to fight and not knowing how to protect yourself when you have to. Would you like me to teach you that difference?" Maya finally found her voice, moving to stand beside Tommy and placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, we shouldn't have bothered you. Tommy, we should go." The man stood slowly, unfolding to his full height in a way that emphasized just how large he was, how much power was contained in that expensive suit. But his expression remained gentle as his dark eyes met Maya's, and she felt something electric pass between them, some crackle of awareness that made her breath catch, despite every instinct screaming at her to be careful. "You're not bothering me," he said quietly. "Your son asked me a question that deserves a real answer. I'm Dominic Santoro." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Maya took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers and the controlled strength in his grip. "And you are?" "Maya Harper." She pulled her hand back as quickly as was polite, trying to ignore the way her skin still tingled where he had touched her. "This is my son, Tommy. We really should—" "I run a youth center about 6 blocks from here," Dominic interrupted gently, his attention shifting back to Tommy. "We offer self-defense classes for kids, not fighting. We're very clear about that. Distinction. But learning how to protect yourself, how to project confidence, how to de-escalate situations before they become physical. Would you be interested in something like that, Tommy?" Tommy's face lit up with hope so bright it was almost painful to witness, and he looked up at Maya with desperate pleading eyes. "Mom, can I? Please?" Maya looked between her son and this stranger, who claimed to run a youth center, but moved like violence was a language he spoke fluently, who wore suits that cost thousands of dollars, and had eyes that suggested he had seen things that would give most people nightmares. Every reasonable instinct she had cultivated through years of therapy and support groups screamed at her that this was a bad idea, that she didn't know this man, that she should grab Tommy and leave and never look back. But then she looked at her son's bruised face and the hope in his eyes, and thought about the way he had asked if some people were just meant to be weak, and felt something crack open in her chest. "Can I see the center first?" she heard herself ask. "Before I commit to anything?" Dominic's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "Of course. I wouldn't expect anything less from a mother protecting her son. The center is open until 8 tonight. If you'd like to stop by, I'll show you around personally." He pulled a business card from his wallet and held it out to Maya, and she took it with shaking fingers, reading the simple black text. Santoro Community Center, with an address and phone number. Nothing about what he did, or who he worked for, or any of the details that would have helped her assess whether this was safe. But Tommy was already bouncing slightly on his toes with excitement, the first genuine smile Maya had seen on his face in weeks, transforming his features, and she found herself nodding despite her better judgment. "We'll come by tonight," she said quietly. "Around 7? "I'll be waiting," Dominic said, and the way he looked at her made Maya's stomach flutter with something that was equal parts fear and attraction. The Santoro Community Center was not what Maya had expected. She had imagined something grim and institutional, perhaps with the faint undertone of criminal activity that would confirm her suspicions about Dominic's real business. Instead, She found herself standing in a bright, clean space that smelled like fresh paint and floor polish, with cheerful murals on the walls, and the sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. The front desk was staffed by a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile, who greeted them immediately. "You must be Maya and Tommy," the woman said. "Mr. Santoro said you'd be coming by. I'm Gloria. Let me take you back to the training room." They followed Gloria through the center, past classrooms where teenagers worked on computers, and younger children colored at tables, supervised by attentive adults, past a small library, and a room that looked like it might be used for counseling or group meetings. The training room at the back was large and open, with padded mats covering the floor and mirrors along one wall. A group of children, ranging from about 7 to 13, were practicing movements under the supervision of an instructor, a compact woman with muscular arms and the patient expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. Dominic stood near the back of the room, watching the class with focused attention, but he looked up the moment Maya and Tommy entered. He had changed out of his suit into dark athletic clothes that somehow made him look even more dangerous rather than less, emphasizing the lean strength of his build and the coiled power in the way he moved. When he crossed the room toward them, Maya had to fight the urge to step back, to put distance between herself and this man, who made her pulse race for reasons she didn't want to examine. "You came," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice that made something warm unfurl in Maya's chest. "Tommy, would you like to watch the class for a few minutes? See if this is something you'd be interested in?" Tommy nodded eagerly, his eyes fixed on the children on the mats, with an intensity that suggested he was already imagining himself among them. Dominic gestured to a bench along the wall, and Tommy hurried over to sit down, leaving Maya alone with Dominic near the doorway. "This is impressive," Maya admitted quietly, her gaze moving around the training room and back to Dominic's face. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Dominic asked, his dark eyes holding hers with that same intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "A front for illegal activity? A recruitment center for future criminals? I can see the suspicion in your eyes, Maya. You're wondering what kind of man approaches a child in a park and offers to teach him to fight." The directness of the statement caught Maya off guard, and she felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment at being read so accurately. "I'm wondering what kind of man runs a community center that clearly costs a significant amount to operate and maintain, and where that funding comes from. I'm wondering why someone who moves and dresses like you do is spending his evening teaching children self-defense. And yes, I'm wondering if there's a catch to your offer, because in my experience, men who seem too good to be true usually are." Dominic's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his features before he controlled it. "You've been hurt before, by someone you trusted." It wasn't a question, but Maya nodded anyway, her arms wrapping around herself defensively. "My ex-husband. 8 years of marriage that taught me more about manipulation and control than I ever wanted to know. So yes, I'm cautious about men who offer help without clear motives, especially when my son is involved." "Your caution is wise," Dominic said quietly. "And you're right to question my motives. So let me be honest with you, Maya. I run a family business that operates in legally gray areas. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending to be someone I'm not. But this center," he gestured around the room with one hand, "this is completely legitimate. The funding comes from my business profits, yes, but the center itself is clean. No illegal activity, no recruitment, just a safe space for kids who need somewhere to go and something positive to focus on." The honesty was unexpected and somehow more convincing than any elaborate cover story would have been. Maya studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found only sincerity and something that looked like old pain. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do you do this?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to where Tommy sat, watching the class with rapt attention. "Because when I was 10 years old, I was exactly like your son, small for my age, quiet, afraid of my own shadow. And the neighborhood I grew up in didn't have much patience for weakness. I learned to fight because I had to, because it was that, or become a permanent victim. But I also learned that there's a difference between learning to protect yourself and becoming the thing you feared. This center is my way of teaching that difference to kids who might otherwise end up making the same mistakes I did. There was something raw and honest in his words that resonated with Maya's own experiences, with her own desperate need to protect Tommy from becoming either a victim or a victimizer. She thought about the bruise on her son's cheek, about the resignation in his voice when he asked if some people were just meant to be weak, and felt something inside her shift and settle. "If I let Tommy join your program," she said carefully, "I need your promise that you're not going to teach him that violence is the answer to his problems. I need to know that you're going to help him become confident without becoming cruel." Dominic held her gaze steadily, his expression serious. "You have my word. And Maya," he moved slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear, "if you want to stay and watch every single class, if you want to be involved in every aspect of Tommy's training, I won't object. Your job is to protect your son. Don't let anyone, including me, make you doubt that instinct." The permission to be protective, to maintain her boundaries without apology, was so unexpected that Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, nodding, and was saved from having to respond when Tommy came running over, with excitement radiating from every inch of his small body. "Mom! Did you see? They're learning how to break holds and get away from someone who's grabbing them. That's exactly what I need. Can I sign up, please?" Maya looked at her son's hopeful face, then at Dominic's calm expression, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Yes? You can sign up." Tommy's whoop of joy made several people in the training room turn to look, and Maya found herself smiling despite her lingering anxiety. Dominic's expression warmed, and he crouched down to Tommy's level with that same surprising gentleness he had shown in the park. "First lesson is Saturday morning at 9, he said to Tommy. "But I need you to promise me something. The techniques we teach here are for self-defense only. Not for starting fights, not for revenge, not for showing off. Only for protecting yourself when you have no other choice. Can you promise me that?" Tommy nodded solemnly, his small face serious. "I promise. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just don't want to be scared anymore." "Then we're going to get along just fine," Dominic said, standing and offering his hand to Tommy for a formal shake. Tommy took it with both of his own hands, and Maya watched the exchange with a complicated mixture of hope and fear tightening her chest. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that became comforting in its predictability. Every Saturday morning, Maya and Tommy arrived at the center at 8:45, and every Saturday morning, Dominic was already there waiting for them with coffee for Maya and an encouraging word for Tommy. The self-defense classes were exactly what Dominic had promised, focused on awareness and de-escalation first, physical techniques only as a last resort. Maya watched every single session from the bench along the wall, and slowly, gradually, she began to see changes in her son. The way he carried himself became more confident. The way he spoke became more assured. And most importantly, the fear that had lived in his eyes for so many months began to fade, replaced by something that looked like hope. The bullying at school didn't stop immediately, but Tommy's response to it changed. He learned to use his voice, to set boundaries, to walk away from situations before they escalated. And on the occasions when walking away wasn't an option, he knew how to protect himself without becoming the aggressor. The calls from the principal became less frequent, then stopped altogether, and Tommy started coming home from school with stories about friends he was making and classes he was enjoying, rather than injuries he needed to hide. And somewhere in the middle of watching her son transform, Maya found herself transforming as well. The hypervigilance that had become second nature after leaving David began to ease, at least when she was at the center. She started arriving a few minutes early and staying a few minutes late, drawn into conversations with Dominic that ranged from parenting strategies to philosophy to the complicated ethics of operating in moral gray areas. He never pushed, never pressured, never made her feel like her caution was unreasonable or her boundaries were unwelcome. But there was something growing between them anyway, a connection that felt both dangerous and inevitable, built on shared understanding of what it meant to survive difficult circumstances and try to become better than your worst experiences. One Saturday in mid-November, after Tommy's class had ended and he was in the locker room changing, Dominic approached Maya with an expression that suggested he had been working up the courage to say something for a while. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said quietly, settling onto the bench beside her with careful distance between them. Maya's pulse quickened, but she nodded, turning slightly to face him. "Okay. Your ex-husband, is he still in the picture? Still a threat?" The question made Maya's chest tighten with old fear, but she forced herself to answer honestly. "He's supposed to stay away. There's a restraining order. But David has never been very good at respecting boundaries, and the legal system is only so effective at protecting people." "Why?" Dominic's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. "Because I've noticed the way you watch the door during Tommy's classes, the way you position yourself so you can see all the exits, the way you tense up whenever a man approaches you, and I wanted you to know that if he shows up here, if he tries to hurt you or Tommy, he'll have to go through me first." The protectiveness in his voice made something warm and dangerous unfurl in Maya's chest. She should tell him that she didn't need protection, that she had spent 2 years learning to stand on her own, that accepting help from a man who operated in legally gray areas was probably a terrible idea. But instead, she found herself saying quietly, "Why would you do that? Put yourself at risk for people you barely know?" Dominic turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because somewhere between the moment your son asked me to teach him to be brave and right now, you and Tommy stopped being strangers and started being people I care about. Because I see the strength it took for you to leave a bad situation and rebuild your life, and I admire the hell out of that. And because when I look at you, Maya, I see someone worth protecting, someone worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with promise and possibility, and Maya felt tears gathering in her eyes, despite her efforts to maintain her composure. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, "how to trust someone again, how to let myself be vulnerable when vulnerability almost destroyed me the first time." "Then don't," Dominic said gently, reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb in a gesture that was over almost before it began. "Don't trust me until you're ready. Don't let yourself be vulnerable until it feels safe. Just let me be here, Maya. Let me show up for you and Tommy. Let me prove that not all men who offer help have ulterior motives." Maya opened her mouth to respond, but Tommy burst out of the locker room at that moment, chattering excitedly about something that had happened during class, and the moment passed. But as they left the center that morning, Maya found herself looking back at Dominic standing in the doorway, watching to make sure they got to their car safely, and something inside her chest cracked open just a little more. The text message came at 2 in the morning 3 weeks later, jarring Maya awake from uneasy sleep with the buzz of her phone against the nightstand. She grabbed it reflexively, her heart already pounding with the kind of fear that came from years of late-night calls that always meant something had gone wrong. The message was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood run cold. "I know where you live. I know where Tommy goes to school. The restraining order was always just a piece of paper, Maya. Time to come home. David." It had to be David, even though the number was blocked, even though she had changed her phone 3 times in 2 years to try to prevent exactly this. Maya's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone, and her mind was already racing through impossible scenarios. Packing up and leaving in the middle of the night, calling the police who had been so ineffective at protecting her before, taking Tommy and disappearing and starting over somewhere new where David couldn't find them. She was still sitting frozen in her bed, paralyzed by fear and indecision, when her phone buzzed again with another message from a different number, one she recognized because it had been programmed into her contacts weeks ago, even though she had never actually used it. Maya, it's Dominic. I hope it's okay that I'm texting. I couldn't sleep and I wanted to check on you and Tommy. Is everything all right? The timing was so impossibly perfect that Maya almost laughed, though the sound came out more like a sob. Her fingers moved before her brain could catch up, typing out a response before she could think better of it. No, everything is not all right. David found me. The response came within seconds. I'm coming over, send me your address. Maya should have said no. Should have insisted she could handle this herself, that she didn't need a man who operated in legally gray areas showing up at her apartment in the middle of the night to play white knight. But instead, she found herself sending her address and then sitting in the dark living room wrapped in a blanket, waiting for headlights to appear in her window. Dominic arrived 20 minutes later, moving through her building and up to her third-floor apartment with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he had done this before. When Maya opened the door, he stepped inside without hesitation, his dark eyes moving over her with clinical assessment before softening into something that looked like concern. Show me the message, he said quietly, and Maya handed over her phone with shaking hands. Dominic read the text message 3 times, his expression growing progressively darker with each reading. Then he pulled out his own phone and made a call, speaking in Italian that was too rapid for Maya to follow, even if she had known the language. When he ended the call, he settled onto her couch and looked at her with an expression that was somehow both gentle and absolutely terrifying. I need to know how serious you are about wanting this to stop, he said quietly, because there are legal channels we can pursue. More restraining orders, police reports, harassment charges. But we both know how effective those have been for you so far. Or there are other options. Options that fall into the gray areas I told you about. Options that would ensure David never bothers you or Tommy again. Maya's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, her mind providing vivid images of what those other options might entail. The reasonable part of her brain, the part that had spent 2 years in therapy learning healthy coping mechanisms and appropriate boundaries, screamed at her to say no, to insist on legal channels, to maintain the moral high ground even if it meant living in fear for the rest of her life. But she thought about Tommy, asking if some people were just meant to be weak. She thought about the bruises and the resignation and the slow erosion of his spirit that had only started to heal in the past 2 months. She thought about David's text message and the promise of more harassment, more fear, more years of looking over her shoulder and teaching her son that sometimes bad people won just because the legal system couldn't or wouldn't stop them. I want him to stop, Maya heard herself say. I want him to never bother us again. I want Tommy to grow up safe and confident and not afraid that his father is going to appear one day and destroy everything we've built. Whatever it takes to make that happen, Dominic. I don't care about the moral implications anymore. I just want my son to be safe. Dominic studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly and pulled out his phone again. Give me 24 hours, he said quietly. Don't respond to any more messages from David. Don't go anywhere alone. And if anything feels wrong or dangerous, you call me immediately, understand? Maya nodded, her throat too tight for words, and watched as Dominic made several more calls in that same rapid Italian. When he finally put his phone away, he moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not so close that she felt trapped or pressured. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. What I'm going to do to protect you and Tommy, it's going to put me in a position where I'm responsible for your safety in a very real way. Not just teaching Tommy self-defense or offering advice. Actually responsible. And that means I need to know if you're comfortable with that level of involvement in your life. Because once I take action, there's no going back to being casual acquaintances who see each other on Saturday mornings. Maya turned to face him fully, reading the sincerity and concern in his expression, and felt something shift inside her chest. I'm asking you to do something that could have serious consequences for you, she said softly. Why would you take that risk? Dominic reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her hand in his. Because somewhere in the past 3 months, you and Tommy became my people. And I protect my people, Maya. Always. The promise settled over her like a warm blanket, and for the first time since receiving David's text message, Maya felt her panic begin to recede. She squeezed Dominic's hand, unable to articulate the gratitude and fear, and desperate hope swirling through her chest, and let herself lean against his shoulder while he made quiet plans to eliminate the threat that had been hanging over her head for 2 years. True to his word, within 24 hours, everything changed. Maya never learned the exact details of what Dominic did. She had made it clear she didn't want to know, and he had respected that boundary. But David's threatening messages stopped immediately. More than that, she received a call from a detective she had never heard of, informing her that David had been arrested on outstanding warrants she hadn't known existed, and would be spending the next several years in prison for crimes that had nothing to do with his harassment of her. The detective mentioned that sometimes dangerous men had other victims, other crimes, and suggested that perhaps the universe had simply caught up with David before he could hurt anyone else. Maya knew it wasn't the universe. It was Dominic, operating in those gray areas he had warned her about, making sure that David faced consequences through official channels that couldn't be traced back to anyone's intervention. And she knew she should probably feel more conflicted about the ethical implications, should probably struggle with the knowledge that she had essentially sanctioned whatever manipulation or coercion had been necessary to make this happen. But when she picked Tommy up from school that afternoon, and he ran to her with a genuine smile on his face, chattering about a school project and a new friend, without any of the fear or tension that had characterized their interactions for so many months, Maya found she couldn't regret her decision. Sometimes protecting the people you loved required operating in gray areas. Sometimes survival meant accepting help from people who existed outside conventional morality. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you couldn't handle everything alone. That evening, after Tommy was asleep, Maya called Dominic and asked him to meet her. They sat in his car, parked outside her building, the November cold seeping through the windows, while they talked in quiet voices about consequences and gratitude and the complicated reality of owing someone a debt you could never fully repay. You don't owe me anything, Dominic said when Maya tried to thank him for the third time. David was a threat. I eliminated that threat. That's all. It's not all, Maya insisted, her hands twisted together in her lap. You put yourself at risk for me and Tommy. You used resources and connections that probably cost you something. You can't pretend this was just a casual favor between acquaintances. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his profile illuminated by the streetlight outside her building. You're right, he finally said. It wasn't a casual favor. It was me making a choice to be part of your life in a way that goes beyond Saturday morning classes and polite conversation. And now I need to know if you're okay with that, Maya. Because I meant what I said before. You and Tommy stopped being strangers weeks ago. You became people I care about, people I want to protect. And if I'm being completely honest, you became someone I'm falling in love with. The confession stole the air from Maya's lungs, made her heart race with a combination of fear and longing that was almost painful in its intensity. She thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea: the danger of his world, the complications of his business, the risk of letting herself be vulnerable again after everything David had put her through. But she also thought about the way Dominic had shown up at 2 a.m. because she needed help, about the way he had kept his promise to protect her and Tommy without asking for anything in return, about the way he looked at her like she was strong and brave and worthy of love. "I'm terrified," she whispered, "of trusting you, of letting you into our lives, of discovering that I'm making the same mistake I made with David and putting Tommy at risk all over again." "Then be terrified," Dominic said gently, reaching across the console to take her hand. "Be cautious and protective, and take all the time you need to be sure about this. But while you're being terrified, let me show you that I'm nothing like David. Let me show you that protection doesn't have to come with control, that care doesn't have to come with manipulation. Let me prove that I can be the kind of man who deserves your trust." Maya looked at their joined hands, at the way Dominic's thumb was tracing gentle circles against her palm, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, but slowly. And if at any point I feel like this isn't safe for Tommy, you walk away, and I respect that decision without question," Dominic finished. "I promise, Maya, your son's safety comes first. Always." The promise settled something deep in Maya's chest, some knot of fear that had been pulled tight for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. She leaned across the console and pressed her lips to Dominic's in a kiss that was tentative and hopeful, and tasted like the promise of something better than anything she had known before. The months that followed were an education in what healthy love could look like. Dominic was patient with Maya's fears, respectful of her boundaries, and genuinely invested in Tommy's well-being without trying to replace his father or insert himself where he wasn't wanted. He continued teaching Tommy self-defense every Saturday morning, but he also showed up to Tommy's school events and helped with homework and played video games with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely enjoyed spending time with a 10-year-old boy. And with Maya, he was everything David had never been: gentle without being weak, protective without being controlling, honest about the dangerous aspects of his life without trying to hide or sugarcoat them. He never made her feel like she owed him for protecting her from David. He never used his power as a weapon or a threat. He simply showed up, day after day, proving through actions rather than words that he was someone she could trust, with her heart and her son's future. One evening in late spring, almost 8 months after Tommy had first approached Dominic in the park, Maya found herself watching from the doorway as Dominic helped Tommy practice the self-defense techniques he had learned. Her son moved with confidence now, his body stronger and his spirit brighter than she had seen in years. And when he successfully executed a particularly complicated maneuver, Dominic's proud smile was genuine and warm, transforming his usually serious features into something that made Maya's heart expand in her chest. "You've gotten so much better," Dominic told Tommy, clapping him on the shoulder with genuine affection. "Remember when you first asked me to teach you to be brave? You thought bravery was about never being afraid, but you've learned it's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. I'm proud of you, kid." Tommy beamed at the praise, then looked past Dominic to where Maya stood watching. "Hey, Mom, can Dominic stay for dinner, please?" Maya met Dominic's eyes across the room, saw the hope and vulnerability in his expression, and felt the last of her resistance dissolve. "Of course he can stay. He's always welcome here." Later that night, after Tommy was asleep and they were cleaning up the dinner dishes together, Dominic pulled Maya close and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with your family, for letting me be part of this, for teaching me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself love again after being hurt." Maya wrapped her arms around his waist and let herself lean into his strength, no longer afraid of the vulnerability it represented. "Thank you for showing up that day in the park," she said, "for seeing my son when he needed to be seen, for teaching both of us that bravery isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and reaching out for help anyway." And in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the evidence of the life they were building together, Maya finally allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most profound transformations, that sometimes asking for help was the bravest thing you could do, and that sometimes If you were very lucky, the person who taught your son to be brave could teach you to love again.